I went hiking alone one early autumn morning, hoping to catch the last colors of the leaves before they fell entirely. The trail started wide and clear, a familiar path I had walked several times in spring and summer, but the forest had changed since the last warm months. The undergrowth had grown thick in the corners, fallen leaves littered the path, and the air was damp, carrying the sharp scent of decaying wood and soil. Mist hovered over the ground, curling around the trunks of oaks and maples, and the light was dim, filtered through the thick canopy. Each step I took pressed leaves and twigs into a soft carpet that muffled my movements, but every small snap of a branch or crack of a twig felt unnaturally loud, echoing through the quiet morning. I had chosen this trail because it was less traveled, winding deeper into the woods than the main loop I usually hiked. At first, everything seemed ordinary. A squirrel darting across a branch, a flock of birds lifting in a sudden swirl from the canopy. I let my pace slow, taking in the subtle shifts in color, the orange and red leaves trembling on branches that had held them for months. The forest felt alive in a way that was familiar, comforting even, until I reached a bend where the trail narrowed sharply, hemmed in by younger trees and thick brush. It was there I first noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they belonged to a deer or a small animal, but the impressions were too large, too deliberate. The mud pressed into the shapes of shoes, recent, unweathered, and heading in the same direction as the trail I had been following. That in itself was not unusual, but as I looked closer, I saw subtle signs of disturbance around the edges. Broken twigs that suggested careful steps, leaves shifted in a manner that seemed deliberate, as if someone had been aware of their surroundings and moving cautiously to avoid detection. A prickle of unease ran through me, but I convinced myself it was a hiker ahead, perhaps someone taking a similar early walk. I moved on, keeping an eye on the ground, but I began to feel the shift in the forest. Sounds that had been distant now seemed unnaturally close. A branch snapping far off in the direction of the trail, a low rustle in the undergrowth, even the faint drip of condensation from leaves hitting the forest floor. At first, I tried to ignore it, attributing every sound to the wind or the normal activity of small animals. But then I realized that every movement I sensed in the trees, every subtle change in shadow or sound, seemed to align with my own steps. When I stopped, the forest fell silent. When I moved, the sounds resumed, close and deliberate. I pressed forward, reaching a small clearing where the sun broke through the trees in thin, pale beams. The ground was soft with leaves and fallen pine needles, and in the center, a large oak had split long ago, leaving jagged wood jutting from its trunk. I paused there, adjusting my pack, and noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The footprints had stopped at the edge of the clearing. There was no indication of where they continued, no faint trail into the thicker forest beyond. I looked around carefully, scanning the line of trees, but the trail was gone entirely, swallowed by shadow and brush. It was then I heard the sound. At first, I couldn't place it, a low, distant exhale that seemed to carry through the mist. It wasn't a voice, not really, but it had a human quality, a deliberate pattern, like someone testing the echo of the forest. My heart rate quickened, and I began to backtrack along the path I had taken, but the trail I had been following seemed unfamiliar now. The dense mist clung to the ground, obscuring familiar landmarks. Roots I had stepped over earlier now seemed to block the way, and the gentle curve of the trail looked sharper, unnatural, disorienting. I started walking faster, scanning the edges of the clearing and the undergrowth. Every so often, I thought I saw a shape, the suggestion of someone standing just beyond the trunks of trees, but each time I turned to look directly, there was nothing. The forest pressed in close, dense, and unyielding, and every step felt heavier, as if the air itself was resisting me. The sound came again, faint, deliberate, almost measured, and it pushed me forward faster, my legs straining against fatigue I hadn't felt earlier. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. I doubled back, circled around, and tried to follow instinct and memory, but the forest seemed to shift with every turn. The fog thickened in low areas, the ground soft, and uneven beneath my boots, roots and rocks hidden just beneath the layer of leaves. Each time I thought I had located a familiar landmark, it turned out to be another tree, another patch of moss. The forest had swallowed the trail entirely, leaving me alone and uncertain. Finally, I spotted a break in the trees, a faint hint of open space beyond the dense line of pines. I moved carefully toward it, recognizing the shape as the edge of the main road I had entered from. Relief came in waves, heavy and sudden, as the familiar stretch of gravel appeared beneath my feet. I stepped onto the road and paused, breathing heavily, listening to the forest behind me. The quiet was back, normal now, the low sounds of wind through the trees and distant birdsong replacing the deliberate echoes I had experienced earlier. The footprints, the subtle signs of presence, and the low exhalation were all gone, leaving only memory. Even after I returned home, the memory stayed with me. I replayed every detail, the careful steps in the mud, the shapes at the edge of my vision, the low exhalation that seemed aware of my movements. I rationalized it in every way I could. A hunter, hikers taking a similar route, an animal producing an unusual sound. But the deliberate quality of the impressions, the way the forest had pressed close and obscured the trail, refused to fit any normal explanation entirely. I have not returned to that trail. I stick to wider paths now, maintain trails where visibility is constant and there are occasional markers, where the presence of other hikers is predictable. The forest is still beautiful, dense, and alive, but the memory of that morning reminds me that even ordinary woods can feel measured, patient, and deliberate. The experience left no physical mark, but it altered my sense of awareness, my caution in places that once felt familiar. The trail I followed that morning remains etched in my mind as a place where the forest can shift and close around you, where footsteps leave a deliberate pattern, and where the line between natural and intentional can vanish entirely until you are far from it and safe. I went into the forest early, the sky still pale and thin with the first light of morning, the air sharp and smelling of frost that hadn't fully melted from the night. My friends and I had planned the hunt for weeks, a short trip into a familiar part of the woods where deer tracks were usually abundant. We carried rifles slung over our shoulders, packs with extra ammunition, water, and a few snacks, though the quiet and the anticipation made eating seem unnecessary. The forest was dense here, oaks and maples thick along the ridge, their roots gnarled and exposed, twisting across the leaf-strewn ground. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot, damp from overnight dew, and every step left a faint imprint that would vanish by midday as the sun reached through the canopy. We had scouted together along the base of the ridge, moving slowly, eyes scanning the underbrush and listening for movement. After an hour, I decided to split off. The ridge offered a better vantage point, a slope where deer often moved in the late morning to browse near the open patches. My friend stayed behind, taking positions among the lower trees, whispering low as they scanned. I moved up the slope alone, careful to step lightly, feeling the uneven ground beneath my boots. The forest felt quiet in a way that pressed against the ears, the normal calls of birds and rustle of small animals muted as if the trees were holding themselves still. It was then that I noticed it, a faint trail of blood along the leaves. At first, I thought it must be a wounded deer, perhaps hit by another hunter who had passed before us. But the pattern didn't match any animal I knew. The drops were larger than a deer's would be, and the spacing was uneven, some splattered, some smeared as though something had been dragged along the ground. My stomach tightened. I crouched to examine it closer, the coppery smell strong in the cold air, rising from the leaves in a subtle, metallic tang. Every instinct told me to turn back, to go straight to my friends, but something in me insisted on following the trail, if only a few steps to see what it led to. I moved slowly, boots pressing into the damp leaves, every snap of a twig sounding louder than it should have. The forest seemed to tighten around me. Shadows stretched long and narrow, and the light that managed to filter through the canopy fell in slivers across the trail. The blood drops led up the slope, curving around thick trunks and tangled roots, disappearing briefly behind a fallen tree, only to appear again. I noticed the smears more clearly now, dark streaks that suggested weight being dragged, the kind of movement a large animal or a person might leave. Then I heard it, a snap of a twig nearby, close enough to make me freeze. My pulse jumped, and I called out to my friends, voice sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet of the forest. Silence. The forest answered with nothing but the subtle rustle of leaves and the occasional distant caw of a crow. My heart pounded harder. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or some small animal disturbed by my movement, but the sound had been deliberate, close, and singular. I turned quickly, scanning the shadows between the trees. Nothing moved. Every bush and sapling seemed to hold still, the air pressing against my skin as I strained to see through the uneven light. I backed away a few steps, following the trail back toward where the blood had started, thinking maybe I'd strayed too far from the main path. The smears continued, fading slightly as the slope leveled, and then they disappeared entirely around a bend in the trail. Panic pushed me to run. My boots slipped over wet leaves and hidden roots, small stones cutting into my soles as I tried to reach the lower ridge where my friends were waiting. Every rustle made me jump, the forest suddenly hostile, alive in ways I hadn't felt when we had been scouting together. My eyes flicked to every shadow, expecting something to be there, something that had been following the trail, something that had caused the blood. But the forest held still, empty and quiet again, the only sound my labored breathing and the snap of branches under my feet. When I reached the base of the ridge, my friends were exactly where we had left them, rifles resting across their knees, scanning the brush but showing no sign of alarm. I told them nothing, forcing a laugh and brushing off the chill that had crept over my skin. They hadn't left their spots, they insisted, and their eyes showed the calm of people who had seen nothing unusual. The blood trail, the smears, the snapping twig. I couldn't explain any of it. I scanned the area carefully, but there was no sign of what I had seen, nothing that could have caused such a trail, and no tracks leading into or out of the bend where the blood had disappeared. The rest of the day passed in a tense haze. I stayed close to my friends, scanning every shadow, ears straining for the slightest sound. My skin itched with awareness, and my pulse remained high even as the sun fell and the forest light dimmed. When we finally left, the blood trail remained unexplained, the source unknown. Weeks later, I thought about it often. I retraced my steps mentally, trying to remember every detail, the size of the drops, the smears, the way the trail curved around trees and vanished at the bend. Nothing in the forest made sense of it. I considered the possibility of an injured animal, though no evidence matched what I had seen. I thought about other hunters, but the area was isolated, and my friends had seen nothing to suggest anyone else had been nearby. The snapping of the twig haunted me most of all, the deliberate sound so close that it had belonged in the same space as me, yet vanished as quickly as it appeared. I never returned to that ridge alone. I went hunting again with friends, sticking to known trails, but I avoided the bend where the blood had disappeared. Even now, when I pass through dense woods, I recall that morning vividly. The sharp smell of metal, the tension of the air, the trail of drops that didn't belong to any animal I know. I know what I saw was real, grounded in the forest and the physical world, yet the source was never found. I have no explanation, only memory. The forest can hold secrets close, even when people are nearby. And sometimes the things that happen quietly in the woods remain unresolved, tangible, and impossible to ignore. That day left a mark on me, not from fear of the forest itself, but from a knowledge that something had been there before me, something that moved through the woods and left traces that made sense only in the moment, vanishing before they could be understood. The ridge remains the same, quiet and still, but every time I picture it, I see the blood on the leaves, the uneven spacing, the smears that suggest weight and movement, and I feel again the careful, deliberate presence that I never encountered directly, but knew had been watching. It was real, entirely human in scale, but entirely untraceable, leaving only the memory of its existence and the unease that stayed with me long after the forest had faded behind me. October 2017. I arrived at the edge of the woods just as the sun was lowering itself behind the thick line of pines. The light already softened into a cold, gray gold that made the shadows stretch long and uneven across the leaf-strewn forest floor. I carried my camera on a tripod, new and heavy, its lenses carefully packed in a padded case. I wanted to see if I could capture something that moved quietly through the trees, a deer or a moose, maybe a fox that lingered close to the edge of the open clearing. The air had that sharp, early fall bite that tugged at the skin of my hands, and each breath I took felt heavier as the light faded. I walked along a narrow trail that twisted in and out of the denser trees. The ground was damp from a recent rain, leaves sticking to my boots with a cold, wet cling. I set my tripod down and adjusted the camera, checking the angle and focus. The forest smelled of wet pine needles and mud, mixed with the faint, sweet decay of fallen leaves. Every sound seemed amplified in the hush of late afternoon. The snapping of a twig under my boots, the rustle of leaves in a gentle wind that carried no warmth. I took a few tentative steps off the path, trying to find a vantage point where the clearing opened into the darker depths of the forest. An hour passed slowly. The light was fading faster than I expected, and the shadows of the tall pines stretched like long fingers across the trail. I crouched behind a low cluster of ferns, adjusting the tripod height, when I noticed the footprints. Fresh in the mud, bare and human-sized. They followed the same narrow trail I had been walking, but the spacing was strange. Longer than normal steps, uneven like the person had been rushing or carrying themselves differently than most people do. I thought at first it was a hunter who had passed by earlier, leaving the forest to myself for a moment of quiet observation. Then I heard it, footsteps echoing my own. At first, I thought it was just my mind, the uneven ground making my steps sound louder, more deliberate than usual. But I stopped, planting both feet firmly in the mud, and the echo continued. A soft, irregular rhythm matching my own, but offset just slightly, as if someone was intentionally keeping pace without closing the distance. I froze completely, scanning the trees ahead. A figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. I saw it for only a moment, a shape that blended into the shadows, taller than a man, standing still, almost impossible to distinguish from the dark trunks and undergrowth around it. I lifted my camera slowly, thinking maybe I could catch a glimpse, but the figure remained motionless, a dark outline against darker trees. It didn't wave, didn't step forward, just stayed there, as though it had been waiting for me to notice. I moved cautiously to a slightly different position, keeping my eyes on the spot where the figure had been. When I looked again, it had shifted barely, staying at the edge of visibility, maintaining distance, yet following the subtle changes in my stance. Every time I stopped, it froze. Every time I moved, it mirrored my steps silently. The forest felt suddenly smaller, more oppressive. Every snapping twig under my boots sounded like a shout in the quiet, and the fading light seemed to swallow the edges of the trail. I tried to convince myself it was someone else, a hunter maybe, or a hiker who had wandered off the main path, but something about the way it moved, so carefully measured, made me doubt that. I kept my breathing low, trying not to make more noise than necessary, stepping over roots and fallen branches with the same caution as if the forest itself were watching. The mud of the trail was thick and cold between my toes, sucking at the soles of my boots, and I could feel the evening chill creeping up my legs through my thin jacket. At some point, I realized I hadn't felt alone for a long time. The quiet around me had a weight, not just the natural hush of the forest, but something else, an awareness. The figure didn't move closer, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was everywhere I turned, in every shadow, pressed just behind the trees, watching. I tried to focus on my camera, adjusting the tripod again, framing a shot of the clearing with no intention of actually pressing the shutter. The forest floor was empty, leaves scattered, faintly wet. Nothing, just the wind stirring the tops of the pines and the distant call of a bird settling for the night. I forced myself to take a few steps forward, then another, keeping the figure in sight. It moved in the same rhythm, silent and deliberate, never breaking the pattern. My pulse had picked up, my hands trembled slightly as I gripped the tripod. I thought about calling for help, about running, but my voice seemed trapped somewhere between my throat and the cold air, too faint, too fragile to carry more than a breath. The light was almost gone when I decided I had to leave. Every instinct told me the same thing. I needed to be back at the car before night swallowed the forest completely. I retraced my steps along the muddy trail, boots sinking slightly with each step. I glanced behind me and saw nothing at first, just the empty trail and the dim, fading shapes of the trees. Then I noticed it, the footprints. They were no longer moving along the trail. They ended abruptly at the edge of the tree line, where the thicker forest began. No sign of someone stepping back onto the path. No continuation into the shadows. I kept moving, the sound of my own steps loud and clumsy in my ears. I didn't dare look behind me again until I reached the edge of the clearing near the road. By then, the last rays of sunlight were gone, and the world felt narrower, harsher, like the forest had exhaled once and closed in. My car was waiting, headlights off, engine cold. I climbed in, shutting the door carefully, and pressed my hand against my face, trying to calm the racing of my heart. I looked at the camera, still on the tripod, reviewing the few shots I had taken. Nothing. Not a single hint of movement in the clearing. No shadows where the figure had been. No trace of the footprints other than my own in the mud, slowly drying in the chill air. I drove home slowly, eyes fixed on the road, but ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The forest passed by in blurred shapes, dark and still. At home, I unpacked the camera, checked every lens, every image, but there was nothing. Just the frozen image of the clearing, leaves scattered, the cold, fading light captured in dull, gray tones. I stayed up long into the night, thinking about the footprints, the figure, the way it had mirrored my steps so carefully. It made no sense. There were no tracks leading back to the clearing, no disturbance in the underbrush, just that faint echo of movement in a place that should have been empty. In the following days, I returned once more to the trail during daylight with no camera, just to see if I could make sense of it. The forest was quiet, normal, and I found no footprints at all, no sign that anyone had been there. I could trace the path of my own steps, but nothing else. I never returned at dusk, never tried to test the edges of the forest in fading light again. Even now, years later, I think about that evening often. Every time I close my eyes, I see the figure still at the edge of the trees, still matching my movements, silent and careful. I understand why it stayed out of reach, why it followed and mirrored me without ever approaching. The forest had its own rules that evening, rules I only glimpsed in the dim light between the pines. The camera never captured it because it wasn't meant to be captured. The footprints ended at the tree line because that was as far as the forest allowed it to be, as far as I was allowed to see. I never saw it again, never tried to, but I know that for that 1 hour, I was not alone, and whatever followed me that evening knew the forest far better than I ever could. The memory stays with me. The cold air, the wet mud, the faint, precise echo of footsteps that were not mine, the still figure that could vanish in a shadow. Every time I walked through the woods, I checked behind me, even in the middle of the day. I know it was real, not a ghost, not a story, just something else living quietly in the trees, moving in ways I could barely perceive. That night in October was a lesson in awareness, in understanding the limits of what we see and what we can truly know. The forest doesn't move for you. It moves with you, sometimes closer than you realize, and sometimes that is enough. I had been reading about an abandoned homestead in the Ozarks for weeks before I decided to go. The descriptions were vague, just mentions of a cabin long left to rot, surrounded by dense forest, and stories of how few people had actually found it. I wanted to see it for myself, to sketch it, to capture what remained before the woods swallowed it completely. I set out alone early in the morning, the air cool and damp, the smell of wet leaves clinging to my clothes as I followed a faint trail that curved between thick clusters of oaks and hickories. The forest was heavy, the canopy so dense that even at mid-morning, sunlight barely touched the ground. Shadows clung to the trunks, pooling in hollows and around fallen logs, making it feel like the trees themselves were pressing close. The trail narrowed as I went deeper, the undergrowth brushing against my legs and hands. Every step pressed the soil beneath my boots, damp and soft, leaving a shallow imprint that would vanish with the next gust of wind or passing animal. Birds called occasionally, far above in the canopy, their sounds thin and distant. I carried a small sketchbook and pencils in my pack, and I kept glancing around, trying to imagine what the cabin would look like when I found it. I followed the curve of a ridge, where the air smelled stronger of moss and decay, and the ground sloped downward into a shallow hollow. That's when I saw it, partially hidden behind a tangle of vines and young saplings. The cabin was mostly collapsed. Its walls leaned at impossible angles. The roof had fallen in, and the doorway was a jagged hole in what remained of the front wall. A few pieces of shattered glass clung to the window frames, reflecting the muted light. I stepped closer, careful not to touch the unstable boards, and set my pack down to take in the structure. The forest was silent around me, the occasional snap of a branch under a squirrel's paw the only sound, and I felt a strange, heavy, quiet pressing from all directions. I drew the lines of the cabin slowly, trying to capture its lean and the angles of the broken roof, my attention shifting between pencil and ruin. Then I heard it, faint, almost swallowed by the wind through the trees. My name, whispered, low and deliberate. I froze. My eyes darted across the clearing, trying to see through the shadows between the trees. There was no one. No movement, no glint of clothing, nothing that suggested a person was nearby. I swallowed hard and told myself it was the wind, the sound of leaves rubbing together, a trick of my own mind. I stayed still for a moment, listening to the soft hush of the forest, the whisper repeating in my memory even though I knew it hadn't been real. I decided to examine the ground around the cabin. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, bare impressions in the damp soil, human-sized, and they circled the cabin. The pattern didn't make sense. There was no trail leading to or from them, no tracks that could explain how the person had arrived or left. The prints formed a continuous loop, beginning and ending in the middle of the clearing, as if someone had stepped out of the air and walked in a perfect circle. My pulse quickened. The forest, so alive and quiet a moment ago, felt suddenly too close, the trees pressing in with their dark trunks and low-hanging branches. I packed my sketchbook quickly and stepped back, trying to keep calm. The wind shifted slightly, brushing against my neck and carrying the smell of damp earth more strongly. Every shadow seemed longer, darker, and I became aware of the small noises I had ignored before. The snap of a twig somewhere beyond the cabin, the rustle of leaves, as if something large moved unseen. I forced myself to walk steadily back the way I had come, keeping my eyes on the faint path. The trees seemed to change around me, the familiar shapes of oaks and hickories taking on unfamiliar angles, as if the forest itself had grown larger, more maze-like. I walked fast, boots sinking into soft mud, leaves clinging to the soles and brushing against my legs. Every step brought a new sense of unease. I felt eyes on me from behind the trunks and in the shadows of the hollows, a presence just beyond my vision. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was imagining things that the stories about the homestead had planted a sense of danger in my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling, not for a second, that someone or something was following, matching my pace, keeping out of view, but never truly gone. The sun was sinking now, streaks of orange and gray fading through the canopy, making the forest darker even though it was only late afternoon. I followed the trail as best I could, but the dense undergrowth forced me into rougher terrain, roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step. My lungs burned from the sudden pace, my hands scraped by branches, and the air smelled more strongly of damp leaves and moss. The forest stretched around me, unbroken and unyielding, until I finally saw the edge where the trail opened into a wider clearing I recognized from the beginning of my hike. Relief pressed against my chest, heavy and urgent, but I kept walking, faster now, until I reached my car. I locked the doors and sat for a long time, heart hammering, breath visible in the cold evening air. The forest behind me was silent in the way it always is when people leave, but I could still feel the weight of those footsteps in my mind, the unnatural loop around the cabin, the whisper that had carried my name. My hands shook as I unpacked my water bottle and checked my sketchbook. The sketches were simple, uneven lines, but even the small drawings seemed to vibrate with the memory of that hour in the clearing. The next morning, I saw the news reports. A hiker had gone missing in the same area I had been in the afternoon before. Search teams were combing the dense forest, helicopters scanning from above, volunteers tramping the trails that felt so familiar to me now. I never told anyone how close I had been, how I had walked into the clearing, how the footprints had circled the cabin with no beginning and no end. There was no evidence of my presence beyond the faint tracks I had left in the mud, which had mostly dried by then. I kept my sketches, my memory of the quiet and the shadows, the sense of being watched even as I moved away from the ruins. It took weeks for the feeling to fade, the awareness that the forest had been attentive, that someone or something had been near, invisible but deliberate. Even now, I think about that day, about the way the sun fell through the canopy, how the shadows lingered in unnatural patterns, and how the quiet of the Ozarks can carry a presence that is impossible to place. I know that I left the cabin safely, that I returned home, but the forest left its mark on me in a way that nothing else could. I understand now why people disappear there. The woods are patient, and they observe. They wait for the right moment to take what they need, and often there is nothing left behind to explain it. I never returned to the homestead. I never wanted to walk that trail again. The sketches remain tucked away, small and fragile reminders of what I saw and felt. The experience stayed with me. The smell of wet leaves, the weight of the shadows, the sound of my name carried on the wind, and the fresh footprints circling the cabin with no clear source. It was real, grounded, and human in every sense, terrifying not for what was impossible, but for what could be done quietly, invisibly, and without a trace. I know the forest, in that place, had witnessed me, and it had chosen to let me leave. I understand now that was a privilege, not a guarantee, and I carry that memory with care. We had planned the camping trip on a whim, a last-minute idea to escape the city and spend a weekend in the woods with friends. The goal was simple: a cheap getaway, fresh air, and a break from work. We drove for hours along winding country roads, tires crunching on gravel, until we reached a small clearing surrounded by dense cedar trees. The trunks were straight and tall, packed close together, the lower branches thick enough that the shadows fell deep and dark on the forest floor. The clearing itself was no more than 50 feet across, just enough for our tents and a small fire pit we dug into the earth. We set up camp in the late afternoon. The sun hung low, scattering gold and orange light through the tops of the cedars. The smell of pine resin mixed with the earthy scent of damp leaves, and the occasional breeze carried it in slow, deliberate gusts. We stacked firewood in a neat pile, the logs lined up beside the pit, and circled the tent with small stones, more out of habit than necessity. Everything felt contained and familiar, the way camping often does before night truly falls. The evening passed without incident. We sat around the fire, the flames crackling softly, sparks drifting upward into the darkening sky. The forest seemed alive in the usual ways. The distant call of a barred owl, the rustle of small animals moving through underbrush, the occasional snap of a branch falling from the canopy. The air cooled quickly once the sun disappeared, sharp against skin and hands, and we retreated into our tents one by one. I fell asleep to the distant sound of voices and laughter fading into the quiet hum of the forest. Around 11 o'clock, I woke suddenly. At first, it was just the feeling that something had shifted in the air, a subtle pressure on the outside of the tent. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, deliberate, carried close enough to brush my ears. I froze, heart hammering, straining to make sense of it. The mesh of the tent allowed me a view of the clearing, but the fire had burned low, leaving shadows that stretched long and thin, distorted by flickering light. Nothing moved. No figure appeared between the trees. No shape crouched in the undergrowth. I crawled quietly to the side of the tent and peered through the mesh. The clearing was empty. The shadows of the cedar trunks swayed gently in the breeze. The firewood pile lay in what I thought should be its original position. But then I noticed subtle differences. Logs that had been stacked neatly were now uneven, some leaning against one another in a way that suggested they had been handled. The circle of stones around the tent was disturbed. A few shifted just slightly, not enough to suggest clumsy movement, but enough to unsettle me. The air felt heavier, every rustle of leaves magnified, every crack of a branch like a footstep. I tried to remain calm, convincing myself that perhaps an animal had wandered through, that a raccoon or a small group of squirrels had moved things in search of food. But the pattern of disturbance didn't make sense for wildlife. The logs hadn't been scattered randomly. They had been rearranged deliberately. The stones were shifted in a manner that suggested someone had walked around the tent, tracing the perimeter. I swallowed hard, heart thumping, and my hand shook as I unzipped the tent partially and peeked outside. The fire had burned to embers, the light faint and red, barely illuminating the immediate clearing. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack and unzipped the tent fully, stepping onto the cold, damp earth. The cedar trunks rose like silent sentinels around me, the shadows stretching long into the darkness. I moved quickly toward the trail that led out of the clearing, flashlight cutting a narrow beam ahead. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp cedar and leaf mold, and I realized the forest was far quieter than before. Every rustle I had assumed was the wind now sounded deliberate, calculated, as if the shadows themselves were shifting in tandem with my movements. Halfway down the trail, the flashlight flickered and went out. Darkness pressed immediately against me, thick and suffocating. I fumbled with the batteries, my fingers brushing against cold metal, leaves, and twigs. Behind me, I heard footsteps, slow, measured, following my pace, but not entirely matching it. Each snap of a twig, each subtle scrape against dead leaves made my stomach tighten. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe another camper had entered the area, maybe an animal was moving cautiously behind me. But the spacing, the deliberate rhythm, and the way the sounds seemed to match my own steps too closely made it impossible to dismiss. I ran, heart hammering, boots sliding on damp leaves, branches scratching my arms. The footsteps stayed behind me, never speeding up, never slowing down, just maintaining a presence I could hear but not see. I reached the first bend in the trail where the moonlight, thin though it was, broke through the canopy. I stopped, chest heaving, and listened. The footsteps continued until they faded gradually, swallowed by the dense cedar shadows further back along the trail. I waited for several minutes, ears straining, before continuing slowly toward the road that led to the main entrance of the camping area. When I finally reached the road, the flashlight clicked back on, the weak beam cutting through the dark. I looked back toward the clearing once more. No movement, nothing beyond the shifting shadows of the trees. The logs were invisible in the dim light, the stones blending into the earth. The forest was silent again, but that silence no longer felt neutral. It felt as though it were aware, patient, and attentive. I didn't stop running until the first distant headlights of cars appeared, and the lights of the campground cabins flickered in the distance. I never stayed in that clearing after nightfall again. We returned the next day, during daylight, to pack up the rest of our gear. The campsite looked ordinary, familiar, with the logs stacked neatly and the stones in their circle, as if nothing had ever been disturbed. There was no sign of anyone having passed through the area, no footprints, no evidence beyond the vague memory of my own panic. I told my friends nothing about the whispers or the footsteps. There was no proof, nothing tangible. I didn't want to seed unnecessary fear. The forest could hold its secrets, and I didn't want to be the one to reveal them. Even months later, when I think back, I remember the sensation of being observed, the weight in the air, the subtle shifts in shadows, the deliberate pattern of movement around the tent. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't imagined. It was human scale, grounded but still untraceable. The disturbance of the firewood, the stones, the measured steps following me. All of it was real, and yet completely unexplainable. I know now that the forest has limits in how far it lets you see and understand. That night, I saw just enough to realize there was awareness beyond my own. A presence that left no trace, but suggested someone had been there, moving silently and deliberately. The memory lingers. I can picture the cedar trunks, dark and close, the faint red glow of dying embers, the subtle pattern of the stones around the tent, and the sense of careful observation. I never returned after nightfall, never took another solo trip there, and never tested the clearing again. The forest had shown me its edge, the point where familiarity ends and caution becomes instinct. I left it at that, carrying the image in my mind, and the knowledge that some nights are better left unexplored, that silence and shadows can hold attention far longer than you realize, and that the ordinary can shift into unease without warning, leaving nothing behind but memory. I went out snowshoeing alone in the Adirondacks one winter morning, hoping to find some quiet and stretch my legs in the deep, silent woods. The snow had fallen thickly over the past few days, covering every trail and branch, leaving the forest muffled and still. Each step I took sent a crisp crack through the drifts, the snow settling around my snowshoes with a soft, sucking sound that echoed through the valley below. The cold air stung my lungs as I breathed, sharp and clean, and my exhaled breath rose in small, white clouds that vanished quickly in the stillness. I followed a narrow ridge, moving slowly, letting the incline tire my legs just enough to keep me aware of my body. The sun was low, pale, and filtered through the bare branches of the hardwoods, making the snow gleam in patches while shadows stretched long and uneven across the slope. I paused occasionally to take in the view, the valley below coated in white, distant hills fading into muted gray where the forest met the sky. It was peaceful, familiar in its stillness, and I let myself lean on my poles for a few minutes, catching my breath. As I rested, my gaze drifted to the trees around me. That's when I noticed something unusual. Holes had been drilled into the trunks, each perfectly round and spaced in a pattern that didn't look natural. Some were low to the ground, some higher, and all seemed deliberate, as if someone had gone through the forest marking the trees. I crouched closer to examine one, noticing that the wood around it was scraped and raw, the edges clean, not chewed or gnawed by wildlife. The quiet of the ridge pressed in, almost oppressive now, and I realized that no bird calls or animal sounds carried here, not even the usual rustle of a squirrel through the bare branches. I looked up and froze. Two eyes glowed down at me from the branches of a massive, gnarled oak. They were yellow, reflecting the pale light in a way that made them seem unnaturally bright, fixed, and unblinking. My first thought was a bear, but bears rarely climb trees like this, and the eyes didn't move, not even as the wind shifted the branches. They remained locked on me, a steady presence that made the air feel heavier. I took a careful step back, and the sound of a branch snapping echoed behind me. My pulse jumped, and I froze again. Another snap followed almost immediately, just out of sight, as if something was keeping pace with me, mirroring my movement without being seen. I turned slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of anything, a bear or another animal, but the forest remained empty. The snow made every sound loud, every footstep a signal, and yet nothing appeared in the periphery of my vision. I moved slowly at first, stepping back down the ridge, keeping the glowing eyes in view. Each branch that cracked, each subtle scrape in the snow, made me shift instinctively, my body coiled in response to something I couldn't see. My snowshoes sank slightly in the drifts, the powder resisting my movement, making each step deliberate. The sun dipped lower, the shadows around the oaks stretching longer, the forest darkening even though it was still mid-afternoon. The ridge fell away behind me, and I realized I'd been standing there far longer than I intended, the weight of observation pressing against my shoulders. I broke into a jog, my poles stabbing into the snow for balance. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, the eyes seemed to vanish, only for a movement in the corner of my vision to suggest they had shifted, following just beyond the edge of the trees. My breathing came in sharp, uneven bursts, fogging the inside of my scarf as I forced myself down the slope, through thick undergrowth and around fallen branches. The snow resisted, the incline making each step heavier, but the sound behind me, soft snaps, distant rustling, kept me moving faster than I had intended. By the time I reached the lower trail, the sun was near the horizon. The shadows of the forest stretched long and dark, making every tree look larger, more imposing, every shape a potential observer. I stopped once, breathing heavily, scanning the trail behind me. Nothing moved. The ridge above was empty, the oak indistinguishable from its neighbors. The glowing eyes were gone. I could see only the pale reflection of snow in the fading light. The forest quiet again, but the sensation of being watched lingered, pressed into the back of my mind. I forced myself to continue, moving quickly along the trail toward my car. The snow beneath my boots was packed, but still uneven, and the forest pressed close, branches reaching into the path, scraping my coat. I focused on the trail, ignoring the shadows, the shapes that seemed to shift just outside my vision. Each snap of a branch, each slight crunch, set my heart racing again, though I never saw the eyes return. I forced my mind to reason it out. A deer high in the oak, reflections from ice, tricks of the dim light, but the feeling in my chest refused to calm. It took almost 2 miles to reach the access road. By then, the sun had fully disappeared, leaving the woods in pale, gray light. My legs burned from exertion, snowshoes packed with ice and snow, but I didn't stop. I kept my gaze forward, ears straining for any sound that might indicate pursuit. The snapping branches never returned, but the weight of awareness, the certainty that I had been observed, didn't leave me. When I finally reached my car, headlights cutting across the untouched snow, I paused to collect myself. I leaned against the door, shivering not entirely from cold, and allowed my breath to settle. The forest behind me was quiet, empty, and the ridge looked entirely ordinary from this distance. I started the engine, letting the heater warm my hands, and drove slowly down the access road, still alert to every sound, every movement, until I was out of the dense woods and back on the main road. In the weeks that followed, the memory stayed with me. I could picture the holes in the trees, clean and deliberate, and the massive oak with the fixed, glowing eyes. I replayed the sounds, the subtle snaps, the way the snow amplified every movement. I told myself repeatedly that it had been a bear, or perhaps a trick of light, but my body remembered the tension, the weight in the air, and the certainty of being watched. I didn't return to that ridge until months later, in full daylight, to retrace my route. The holes in the trees were still there, ordinary and unremarkable in the pale winter light. The oak was no different from the others surrounding it. There were no tracks beyond my own in the snow, nothing to suggest any presence besides what I had imagined. Yet the memory remained, the feeling that something had observed me carefully, measure my movements, and let me leave on its own terms. I don't go snowshoeing alone in that area anymore. I avoid that ridge entirely, choosing safer, open trails where visibility is constant. The forest is still beautiful, still silent, but I carry that day with me, the clear image of those eyes, and the knowledge that the woods can hold attention without being noticed, and sometimes that is more unsettling than any tangible threat. I set out into the Smoky Mountains in late September 2020, just before dawn. The air was crisp and damp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wet soil. The valleys were filled with thick fog that clung to every tree and boulder, moving like water through the forest. My goal was simple: photograph the mist rolling through the ridges and capture the early light filtering through the fog. I had my camera ready, tripod packed, boots laced tight, and a small pack with water and snacks. The forest was quiet, muted by the heavy mist, and every sound carried further than usual. The crunch of leaves under my boots echoed softly, and distant birdsong seemed muffled and hollow. I followed a narrow trail that twisted up the ridge, marked faintly by worn soil and occasional blazes of orange paint on tree trunks. The mist hung low, obscuring the valleys below, and I had to step carefully to avoid hidden roots and rocks beneath the snow-colored leaves. The path was easy to follow at first, but the fog thickened quickly, swallowing the trail and reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead. Shadows formed in the gray air, branches and trunks appearing and disappearing as I moved. I stopped often, adjusting my camera, capturing silhouettes of trees and the veiled ridges, the mist curling through the hollows like slow-moving smoke. About an hour into the hike, I stumbled upon a small cabin, hidden behind a tangle of brush and cedars. The structure was simple and abandoned looking at first glance, its wood weathered and darkened by years of exposure. The door hung open slightly, and the roof sagged under the weight of accumulated leaves and moss. Curious, I approached, the crunch of fallen branches underfoot sounding louder than it should have in the quiet. The cabin was smaller than I expected, a single-room structure with a low ceiling. I could see through the doorway that the floor was bare except for scattered debris and a few items that suggested someone had been there recently. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp wood and smoke, though the hearth was empty. Empty cans lay on a counter, crushed and rusting, and a blanket, worn and folded, sat near what had once been a bed. The blanket looked fresh, not something left from decades ago, and it made my stomach tighten. I stepped fully inside, careful not to disturb anything, moving slowly across the uneven floorboards. My boots creaked against the wood, the sound magnified in the still air. I raised my camera to capture the scene, trying to convince myself that nothing about this was unusual. Then a drawer slammed shut. The sudden sound made me jump, my heart hammering in my chest. I froze, scanning the room, expecting a gust of wind, maybe a loose hinge, something to explain it. But the door was still slightly open, and the mist outside pressed against the window frames, still and dense. The sound had been sharp and precise, a single slam that echoed once, then left the cabin quiet again. I felt my pulse spike, every nerve on edge. I told myself it was a natural reaction, that an old cabin would have shifting wood and loose drawers. But the timing, the suddenness, and the proximity to my presence made it impossible to dismiss entirely. I stepped back toward the doorway, ready to leave, but as I moved, the mist outside thickened. The familiar shapes of the trail and surrounding trees vanished, replaced by gray walls of fog that pressed close, limiting visibility to only a few feet in every direction. I stepped outside cautiously, looking for the path, but the ridge was unrecognizable. Every tree looked the same, every shadow distorted by the mist. The forest, which had seemed inviting and calm earlier, now felt constricting and disorienting. My boots sank slightly into soft soil, and every sound, the whisper of wind, the fall of a branch, the scrape of my backpack against my shoulders, was amplified in the eerie stillness. I moved slowly at first, retracing my steps mentally, trying to remember landmarks, a bent cedar, a cluster of rocks, the slope of the trail. None of it seemed right. The fog had erased the details, leaving only the sensation of being enclosed, pressed in by the forest. My breathing became faster, uneven, as I tried to remain calm, telling myself that I had been through dense fog before, that the trail was still somewhere beneath my feet. I adjusted the camera on my shoulder, using it as a shield against the uncertainty, stepping carefully over roots and rocks I could barely see. Hours passed, or it felt like hours. Time was difficult to measure in the mist, the sun still low, the forest unchanging in its gray tones. I moved cautiously, one foot in front of the other, relying on memory and instinct to guide me. Every now and then, I paused, scanning for any indication of the trail, any familiar shape that could orient me. Shadows shifted, branches bent in ways I didn't recall, and every sound, twig snapping, leaf rustling, made me flinch. There was no one there, no figure, no visible presence, but the forest felt alert, as if it were watching my every move, waiting for me to make a mistake. Eventually, after hours of careful movement and frequent pauses, I caught a glimpse of a familiar blaze on a tree. My pulse surged as I recognized the trail again, the ridge sloping down to the access path I'd started from. Relief washed over me, heavy and sudden, but I didn't slow down until I saw the first signs of the parking area and the distant hum of a passing car. My legs were tired, my hands raw from gripping the poles in my pack, but I felt a sense of safety return with the open space and clear line of sight. Even after returning home, the memory lingered. The cabin, the subtle signs of recent use, and the slammed drawer haunted my thoughts. I replayed every detail, the worn blanket, the empty cans, the precise, deliberate quality of the noise that had startled me. I rationalized it repeatedly, attributing it to natural causes: wind, shifting wood, misperception in the fog. Yet I can't shake the sense that something had been present inside that cabin, aware of me, patient and still, waiting without needing to reveal itself. I never returned to that trail alone at dawn. I stick to broader paths now, those where visibility is constant and familiar landmarks guide every step. The forest is still beautiful, and the fog can still roll through the valleys in the way I had hoped to photograph. But the memory of that cabin reminds me that even ordinary places can conceal deliberate presence, and that the quiet of the woods can hold attention in ways that leave a lasting impression. Every time I think of that morning, I feel the weight of the space inside the cabin, the sense that someone or something had noticed me, and the slow, deliberate way the forest can alter itself to hide its secrets. I found the old logging trail by accident, a narrow path barely visible through the dense undergrowth. It was the kind of trail that had likely been and used for decades, the earth softened by years of fallen leaves and the constant creep of plants reclaiming the forest. My curiosity had drawn me there. I wanted to see if I could find abandoned equipment or remnants of old logging sites, artifacts of human labor left behind to rot among the trees. The forest was quiet that morning, the sun low and muted behind a haze of early fog, filtering pale light through the canopy. Every sound I made, the crunch of leaves, the scrape of my boots over roots, seemed amplified in the still air. The trail was overgrown, almost hidden in places. Small saplings had taken root in the center, forcing me to step carefully to avoid breaking the fragile stems. Moss climbed the sides of the few standing stumps, and the smell of damp wood and soil filled my nose. At first, everything seemed ordinary, the kind of wilderness I had walked in countless times. But as I moved deeper, something began to feel off. I noticed subtle signs of recent human activity: a cigarette but half buried in leaves, footprints pressed into the soft mud that weren't old enough to have been washed away by rain, and a few rocks arranged in rough circles on the forest floor, deliberate enough to suggest attention and care. I paused to examine one of the rock formations. The stones were small, rounded, and placed just so, creating a crude pattern. There was no natural reason for their arrangement, no fallen branches that could have caused them to land in such a way. The thought that someone had been here recently, someone who moved deliberately through this forgotten trail, pressed into my mind with an uncomfortable weight. I looked around, scanning the forest in every direction. The fog hung low, a thin, shifting veil that made distance and depth difficult to judge. The woods seemed thicker here, the trunks closer together, shadows stretching unnaturally across the ground. I continued along the trail, trying to push the uneasy feeling aside. The footprints repeated at intervals, sometimes clear, sometimes fading into the soft leaf litter. I noticed more cigarette butts as I walked, some crushed, some untouched, and I began to wonder how long these people had been in the area and why. There was no sign of vehicles or larger equipment, just these small, deliberate marks of human presence, scattered through the forest as if someone had been testing the path, moving carefully without leaving much behind. Then it happened. A distant shout echoed through the valley, a single, harsh sound that carried over the forest in a way that made me freeze. It was human in tone, but stretched, strained, and raw, almost unnatural in its pitch and timing. My stomach tightened, and every instinct told me to turn back. I scanned the ridge and the tree lean, expecting to see a hiker or a hunter, but there was nothing. The forest swallowed the shape of whoever, or whatever, had made the noise. My pulse quickened, and I realized that I could no longer see any markers of the trail ahead. The faint path I had been following seemed to vanish among the moss, roots, and undergrowth. The shadows of the trees blurred together in the mist, and I felt the sudden, sharp awareness of being in a place that wasn't entirely familiar or safe. I tried to retrace my steps, stepping carefully over roots and stones, brushing past saplings, but every bend in the trail looked the same, every tree a duplicate of the one before. The fog thickened, and the forest swallowed my sense of direction. The sound of leaves shifting under my boots felt exaggerated, like every step was louder than it should have been, and every snap of a twig behind me made me flinch, though I never saw anyone. I forced myself to keep moving, following memory rather than sight, but the trail refused to reveal itself. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by distant birds whose call seemed unnatural in their timing, and the occasional crash of a branch falling somewhere out of view. Hours passed, or so it felt. I moved in slow, deliberate circles, doubling back when I thought I recognized a bend, only to find that the path had shifted in the fog, or I had imagined the marker. My legs burned with fatigue, and my backpack seemed heavier with each step. Every part of the forest looked identical. The same twisted roots, moss-covered stumps, and gray-green shadows. I realized that the deliberate marks I had seen earlier, the cigarette butts, footprints, rock formations, had stopped appearing, leaving only the blank, unyielding forest. I was alone, disoriented, and painfully aware of the trail I could no longer find. Finally, after what felt like hours of careful, anxious movement, I caught sight of a familiar break in the trees. A patch of sky appeared through the canopy, brighter than the surrounding gray, and I knew I had found the main road. Relief washed over me, heavy and sudden, as I stepped onto the gravel, the sound of tires on stone nearby, grounding me in reality. I paused to catch my breath, scanning the forest one last time. The trail I had followed was gone, swallowed entirely by the undergrowth, and there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have caused the sounds I'd heard. The fog lingered among the trees, but the oppressive weight of being watched and lost had lifted slightly. Even after I returned home, the memory stayed with me. I replayed every detail, the cigarette butts, the footprints, the rock circles, and that distant strange shout. I rationalized it repeatedly. Hikers, hunters, a prank, my own nerves exaggerating the sound in the still forest. Yet the unease persisted. I could picture the trail disappearing into the moss, the fog thickening around me, and the way the forest seemed to press close, deliberate, and patient. I haven't returned to that trail. I stick to broader, maintained paths where visibility is constant, with our markers and other hikers nearby. The forest is still beautiful, dense, and alive, but that logging trail remains etched in memory as a place that hides more than it reveals, where human presence can feel deliberate and controlling, and where disorientation can make a simple hike into something far more unsettling. Every time I think of it, I feel the weight of that forest pressing in, the quiet anticipation in the fog, and the certainty that I was being watched, even though I never saw anyone. The experience left a mark, not in physical harm, but in the awareness that some woods can measure you, track you, and leave you lost without leaving a trace.